Hi, kids. Okay, so this one is going to be a little bit of a lengthy one, but I would ask you to bear with it because it kind of sets up how we're going to look at the rest of the year. This is the last part of the introductory notes before we jump into the new material. And the subject of this set of notes for today is Lincoln, the Civil War, and restoration of the intent of the founders. The American Civil War has become something of a it's a very romanticized, very intensely studied, very passionate topic for a lot of people, especially people who may have had family in the war or who have some connection to the war or another. And what really has begun to sort of maybe let's take this back a couple of steps real quick. The American Civil War was fought between two geographic regions of the country, the North and the South, over the issue of did the states or the national government, federal government, whichever way you want to put it, have the ultimate authority in the issue of slavery. And the southern states seceded or left the Union because they maintained that only the states had those rights and powers, largely based on the language of the 10th Amendment and the nature of the Constitution itself. The North disagreed with that. Now, the North won the war, but what began growing in the decades after the Civil War was a very slow but steady push that, really the wrong side won the war. And if you're not really following this, let me try to clarify it a little bit for you. The argument or the logic of that statement goes like this. The Civil War was really about the Constitution. And the South respected the structure of the Constitution, specifically as it was outlined by the 10th Amendment of the Bill of Rights, that the federal government was extremely limited in its power, that the federal government exceeded that power, and that the states were only exercising their rights and powers against a tyrannical central government, essentially a second American Revolution. That the war itself was about the issue of the rights of the states and the intent of the Constitution. That narrative has been very widely accepted to the point now where there are a lot of fairly right leaning politically or conservative political thought thinkers who go along those lines. That the real issue of the war was states' rights, and that the South had the right, was on the right side of that, and that it was unfortunate they were bullied and they lost. One of the problems with this argument is it sort of glosses over what specific right did the South think that they had that the North was trying to take away, and that right is the issue of slavery. Okay, and my hope is that you will see after I'm done with this why it is that the North's position is actually the one that was about restoring the intent of the Constitution and following it. That is not to say that there weren't abuses by the North, but realistically, if you look, you can counter pretty much every abuse of the North's power by an abuse of the Southern central government's power. But I sort of wander off tangent there. But let's go with this. The issue of slavery and how it will build up to where we're going to start now. Slavery was originally included in the Declaration of Independence, not as a right of the people that we're looking for. No, 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 no. It was listed as one of the crimes that George III was guilty of. And Jefferson was not at all happy when, in order to keep the southern colonies happy, his editors removed that portion of it. He still went along with the whole declaration thing and what was going on because he truly believed in the cause that America was fighting for, but he was not happy that that slavery as a charge of inhuman behavior and crimes was removed from the Declaration. Fast forward a few years to after America wins the war and gains its independence. Under the Articles of Confederation, Jefferson wrote a law, the Northwest Ordinance and the Ordinance of 1787, or 1785, pardon me. These laws talked about what to do with the area of land around the Great Lakes region, the modern states of um, Michigan, Minnesota, Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, Ohio, that area. In the Northwest Ordinance, it was established how the states should be set up and created. And Jefferson also put in there that those new states would not have slavery, which set the sort of prototype for all new states coming in. Now, interestingly enough, the southern states approved the ordinances, even with the restrictions on slavery. Why? Even though it limited slavery, the southern states were fairly confident that it didn't matter because those areas didn't need slaves anyways, and it would have been really stupid to have worried about it. Now, let's fast forward a few years again. Um, the Constitutional Convention is going on to deal with the issue of how bad the Articles of Confederation are. Go back and read the Constitution. Nowhere in the Constitution is the word slave ever really used. They are referred to as persons in servitude or persons in bondage. Now, why is this important? Because it goes back to Jefferson's original statement in the Declaration of Independence, essentially outlining that everybody is human. All of them are people. Now, in the constitutional debate, there becomes a sticking point between the North and the South. And I apologize, I'm going to have to talk math here. I really don't want to, but I have to. It has to do with the issue of how slaves are counted. And the North says, well, they're people. We need to count them for the number of people in the state for taxing, as well as how many people in the state. And the South has a very different argument. The South's argument is yes, they're people, but they're not American citizens. So therefore, they don't count for taxing. But they would count for population because they're still here. Uh-huh, uh-huh. And the North's like, no, either they count for both, they don't count for either. This is where you get what is known as the three-fifths compromise. The three-fifths compromise says, and remember, by its nature, a compromise is something that both parties accept, but they're not super happy about because they don't get all of what they want. The three-fifths compromise says that in a group of, when we're counting slaves, we're going to group them into groups of five, and that every five will count the equivalent of three American free citizens for the purposes of taxing and representation. It does not say that slaves are only three-fifths of a human being. That is a great abuse of language. What it says is that when counting for purposes of taxes and representing in government, the non citizen, non free blacks in America will be counted in groups of five and have the same voting and tax equivalent as three free people. Now, why is this difference important? Because there were free blacks in America and they had full rights and citizenship where they were. They were not counted as three-fifths of a person. It only has to do with the issue of slavery. They never say they're not human. They just look at them mathematically as groups as opposed to individuals. Now, additionally, the Constitution outlawed the slave trade after 1808. Well, so what's important about whoa, about all these things that I just talked about? Okay, let me go back over here. What's important in this whole group of things is this. Most of the founding fathers all sincerely believed that within a generation, about 40 years, slavery would be gone. It was no longer economically viable. So, while it wasn't something that many of them wanted, they were willing to tolerate it because eventually it would just go away and everybody would be okay with that. Even the South privately admitted that slavery probably wouldn't last very long because it was just too expensive. What changed all that? It's how to look at, or don't forget the economics rule number six. Choices have unintended consequences. The unintended consequence is the cotton gin. So I could be wrong on this number. It's just sort of illustrative purposes, but I want to say that it was something like it took 50 slaves to produce 1 pound of cotton because of the amount of effort that it took to get the seeds out of the cotton. What the cotton gin did was, it was, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, I would look it up if I were you. It's an interesting little device. It's essentially a big round drum with little like pokies on it, like a fork or a comb. And as you turn it in a circle, those pokies grab the seeds and they pull them out. Eli Whitney created the cotton gin, ironically enough, because he wanted to help speed up the end of slavery by making slaves not really necessary because the machine would do the work. What ended up happening was is that it actually made cotton profitable, allowing the South to actually have more slaves to grow more cotton. The country becomes divided geographically. Now, this is where let's go back to what Washington said. Don't value one section of the country over the other. We're all Americans. And yet, that's precisely what ended up happening. The southern states valued themselves and their area of the country and their peculiar institution of slavery higher than they did the fact that they were Americans. Now, let's move forward about roughly, say, 60 years in the future. Abraham Lincoln wanted to go back to the original vision and intent of the founders, which was slavery would be limited and it would eventually die out on its own. This is why he was actually willing to compromise and let the South, the southern states, still keep their slaves because that would limit it, contain it, and would eventually die out. The South broke away out of fear of just that thing happening, the slavery being contained and limited and dying out on its own. It became necessary to fight a war in order to do it. And that the Union, as set up by the Constitution and as encouraged by George Washington, value the country above your state or locality, that the Union and the Constitution needed to be saved. And the only way to do that, the only way to realize the intent of the founders, which was that slavery would be removed and die out and go away, was it became necessary to fight a war. In 1863, seeing that slavery needed to be helped pushed along and to really make it explicitly clear that slavery was an issue in the fighting, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. With the end of the war in 1865, slavery was officially abolished, leading to the rather peculiar and super bad Reconstruction period, which is where we are going to pick up on Tuesday with our brand new unit. Okay. Peace and love.